All right. How's it going, class? Here we are with Unit 8, and you just completed your midterm. So I'm sure some of you are wondering, well, where do we go from here for the second half of the class? And this is where I want to break down what the future units are going to look like and conceptually what we're going to be working on now that I think you have a pretty good basis for the structure of the course, where we've been. And then we'll talk about John Muir, we'll talk about a little bit about ecology, and then we'll start examining the major tenets for the second half of the class. So, first thing that we want to do is that we need to understand ecology. Ecology is a pretty key way in which we learn to understand nature and the environment. So we're going to be going into ecology. I'm not asking you to memorize ecology and its nuances and all of its different facets. It's an entire science. You could spend your entire career studying ecology. I want you to understand ecology from 20,000 feet. What is ecology? How do ecologists go about studying the environment? When we read Patty's character in her study of trees, she is required to embark on the study of ecology in order to be able to understand the relationship between the trees and the other organisms. So again, we're not studying concrete concepts within ecology. I would want you to have a very broad overview of what ecology and how that influences, obviously, how ecological knowledge influences our collective environmental and or your environmental imagination. The other thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at authors and philosophers, more contemporary authors and philosophers from the early 1900s on forward to present day, or more modern day. I don't know anybody we're going to be studying well, Wendell Berry's pretty present. So we're going to be looking at authors and philosophers and what they've done and how they challenge contemporary views of the natural world. So a lot of these authors are pushing people to think about their environmental imagination differently. All in all, my overall goal is for you to refine and define what is your environmental imagination. What do you think about the environment? What do you think about the human role in the environment? How do you see the historical constructs of environmental imagination throughout different pieces of literature? Um, this last 6 weeks will obviously be a culmination of all of these ideas into forming some type of concrete notion for you, for yourself. So, all right. So, moving on. First off, we need to talk about briefly what is ecology. And so, just so you have the broadest notion, you watch those two crash course videos, which interesting. I didn't know, but I learned just recently that the crash course videos are made and published by two brothers who live in Missoula. So I thought you guys might all be interested to know that. What is ecology? Ecology is the study between organisms and their physical environment. So it's organism to organism, in organisms to physical environments. That's the most base definition of what ecology is. And so, what this would be suggesting is a more complex understanding of the natural world. And so we know sciences, as a result of the Enlightenment, are constantly trying to refine and adapt their understanding of the science of the natural world into smaller pieces. And by understanding all of these small pieces, ecology brings it back together to try to understand the whole. And so, one quote, this is me paraphrasing, but one quote I came across in my research was that life on Earth is more than the sum total of the plants, animals, and raw materials. So, you can study plants and you can study geology and you can study the physical world. You can study biology. You can study animals. You can study all of these things. But each of those alone doesn't provide a robust understanding of the natural world. In order to really understand the natural world, we must study the relationships between all of these factors to truly understand life on our planet. And so if you look here, this is the fields of biology. And this is, this is a pretty generic chart. Obviously, there's some things that aren't on here. It's the best one that I could find. But if you look, main group of living things, you've got zoology, microbiology, bacteriology. Over here, structure and function, physiology, histology. You get the idea. You can go ahead and pause and look at this chart more carefully. But over here, living things in their environment, which obviously environmental imagination, environmental concerns, or interactions, and ecology is right there. And so, and then here, science, biogeography, which is looking at how biology and geography interact, which also is going to influence ecology. So just so you all know, which some of you may, is that ecology is a fairly new science as far as sciences are concerned. It started in the mid 1800s and really didn't get fully kicking until the 1900s. And as you can see with Patty's article suggesting that trees actually have interactions, and they communicate on a molecular chemical basis in order to help forewarn each other. It's not, they're not sitting there having a conversation about philosophy, but Patty and scientists, who Patty represents a real scientist, they were starting to realize that there were measurable interactions that we couldn't see with the naked eye between organisms. And that would be into the late 1900s. This would continue to be kind of controversial because people would view the study of these relationships. Sometimes they would claim that they were a bit romantic. And so these early ecologists were tasked with a pretty challenging situation where they had to have an overabundance of evidence. And they had to convince their more traditional colleagues that these interactions between these organisms were really a really important part of the ecosystem and how different species adapted and evolved together, and the the relationships between the different organisms being of utmost priority. And so here you can see ecology. Again, this is pretty generic, but includes physiology, genetics, evolution, behavior, all come together. And there's others I think we could add in here, but all come together to create the study of ecology. Pretty broad, complex study. I think that you will find there are going to be lots of continued developments in ecology over the coming decades as we understand more and more of these very small, nuanced relationships, that mutually beneficial relationships between organisms, like the mycorrhizal that we studied earlier on, that sort of thing. All right. So John Muir is our guy for this particular unit. John Muir, great naturalist writer, and one of my when I was in college, he definitely struck a chord for me. His writing is borders between scientific and creative. He definitely has that sort of romantic view. He talks about the sublime and the beautiful when he talks about going into the tree. I'll pull a quote here. He's interested in studying the trees and the wilderness, but he doesn't do it necessarily through an ecological lens. He does it through a more romantic lens, but at the same time, he's pretty precise with his observations. There's a book that he wrote about called 1,000 Mile Walk to the Sea. Great book. And it's more of a journal than anything else about him walking from the northern Midwest all the way to the Gulf of Mexico and all of the plant and the flora and the fauna that he observes along the way. But in and amongst this kind of this naturalist tendency in his writing, he also will write passages like this. And this is on 96 of the reading that you had to do for today. He said, I suddenly recognized a sea breeze as it came sifting through the palmettos and blooming vine tangles, which at once awakened and set free 1,000 dormant associations. So he's already talking about, he's he's up in this tree, and all of these things started coming to him because he could smell the ocean being a long ways off from where he climbed up this tree, but he could still smell the ocean because the wind and the storm was blowing through off the coast of California, which at once awakened and set free 1,000 dormant associations, made me a boy again in Scotland. In the intervening years had been annihilated. So he turns into a boy. We know that youthful innocence associated with romantic. Most people like to look at mountain rivers and bear them in mind, but few care to look at the winds, though far more beautiful and sublime. And so he talks about how the winds having this fear. I mean, climbing up 100 feet into the crown of a tree in the middle of a windstorm, which I don't know how many of you experience storms on the coast, or even within a few hundred miles of the coast, but they can be quite aggressive, powerful storms. And he's up in this tree swaying back and forth, talking about youthfulness, innocence, the beautiful, the sublime, all of these things. Yet at the same time, as he goes through his description, he has all sorts of details that would be more traditionally associated with maybe the study of botany. And so he really bridges this gap between, I would say, between a literary romantic tendency and a more rationalist botanical or ecological tendency. And so he's very interesting author in that way, philosopher and conservationist. So as you know, he was good friends from the documentary. He was very good friends with Teddy Roosevelt, and he believed he was very much a part of that romantic movement to protect areas, to set wilderness aside. He has been honored more recently as the main guy on the California Quarter. Each state has its quarter. And so he has Yosemite Valley, John Muir. He was very interested in protecting Yosemite Valley and Yosemite National Park. If you've never been there, it's terribly crowded, but it absolutely beautiful, beautiful place in this continent, in this country. So in part of what is now Yosemite Park, in the north part was the Hetch Hetchy Valley right here. And some claim that it rivaled the beauty of the Yosemite Valley, which this is the Yosemite Valley here behind Roosevelt and Muir. And they wanted to dam the Yosemite Valley in order to, they did they talked about damming the Yosemite Valley, but they ended up damming the Hetch Hetchy Valley in order to bring water into the growing city of San Francisco at the time. John Muir was adamantly against this, and as a result, he fought and lost to protect Hetch Hetchy and for San Francisco to find its water from somewhere else. But these actions would start the Sierra Club, because as you know or don't know, but these mountains in this part of California right here are called the Sierras. And so the Sierra Club was originally in the late 1890s, I believe the Sierra Club was formed, was a conservation club geared towards protecting wild places and natural spaces and that nature corridors within this area. So as we're talking about, we look at our character Doug within the book, and we start looking at characters who are trying to protect trees, to protect certain things. There's a growing debate by the late 1900s or late 1800s, early 1900s in this country about what constitutes conservation. What do we need to set aside? What do we keep wild? What do we keep preserved? And what do we use for industrial purposes? And so this is an ongoing debate. It's a debate here in our very community on a regular basis. It's a debate in our region. What do we do? Building dams is in the case of Hetch Hetchy, is by many regards considered a green energy. And it's quite clean. It's quite renewable. But then at the same time, you typically bury vast tracts of river corridor. Even if we look at the South Fork here in the Flathead Valley, we dam the South Fork, back in the 1960s. And we did that to prevent flooding throughout the Flathead Valley. But we also did it to create hydropower, which we all greatly benefit from, very inexpensive, entirely renewable green power. So it's a complex debate. It's not so as I was suggested on that previous slide, I'm interested in all of you working to develop your own, and which I know you already have one, but maybe looking at it more critically as to why do you feel a certain way about the environment and how we conceive of our role. When I say our, I mean collectively humanity's role within the environment. So this becomes a question of what do we do with nature? What do we do with the wilderness? What do we do with the environment? What if we look down here, I've kind of put all these competing ideas of conservation. We know we have rampant population growth, we have industrialization, we have technological advancement, we have consumption, we have environmentalism, carrying capacity, which you should understand from the ecology crash courses that we watch. And so it all comes down to anthropocentrism or anthropocentric. And I don't know how many of you know this, but anthro is man and centric is center. And so anthropocentric is man-centered or human at the center. And so we know for a long time within the study of the stars, and if we go back to some of the very early units and lessons here, is that for a long time we believed that the Earth was the center of the universe. And that's quickly got modified, center of universe. Sorry about my writing here. Center of the universe. And so now in our role on the planet, because we are the dominant species, we are by far the most cognitively advanced species on this planet. The human brain is terribly, terribly complex. And we put ourselves typically at the center. Our needs, which any species will do this I don't think is inherently greedy, but our needs come before the needs of the trees or the needs of any other organism out there. The problem is that, a lot of ecologists, naturalists, environmentalists will tend to bring up is that what is the carrying capacity of the human species? Obviously, we're still doing a pretty good job of carrying 7 billion of us, but there tend to be unintended consequences in the form of pollution, destruction of the natural environment. But then at the same time, we have made massive advances in industrialization and technology and science and understanding. And all of this consumption has come with absolutely fantastic benefits to us. So again, the question becomes, how human-centered do we want our role in the world to be? How human-centered is it just going to be? And just by the byproduct of the fact that we obviously, if it comes down to us cutting down a tree to stay warm, or being cold and freezing to death, we're going to cut down the tree to stay warm. And we're going to do that every time. And so these environmental writers are going to ask us pretty complex questions, sometimes pushing us, sometimes we'll disagree with them and think they're crazy. Sometimes we'll find that they have some pretty insightful observations and critiques. And so basically, what is humankind's role in the natural world? And I would argue that all of that is our environmental imagination informs our answer. That whatever we imagine the environment to be, whether we imagine it in very ecological, scientific, precise terms, or romantic terms, or transcendental terms, or rational terms, however we imagine it as individuals, that becomes our own environmental imagination. And so I want you, over the course of the next few units, to look at your environmental imagination, critique it, examine it, dig out where it came from in your own cultural, familial, economic past, and then what you think of it. And maybe this will cause some good reflection and self-observation, and some re-examination, which ultimately I think is always the point of education. The point of education is is not inherently to change any of our perspectives. Its primary basis, in my opinion, is to understand where our perspectives come from and to stringently critique our own perspectives and opinions and ideologies as an attempt to better understand them, and at the same time to find places where we may need to alter them based on new evidence and new ideas. So, your environmental imagination, what is it?